everyone. Welcome back to the White Coat Club. My name is Lindsey, and I am one of the counselors at Moon Prep. Today, I have my fellow counselor, Nicole, with me, and we're going to be discussing MCAT versus no MCAT BSMD programs. Now, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more great content about direct med and medical school admissions. Now, before we get started, I wanted to introduce our special guest. We also have Kavya here with us. She is one of our med mentors and essay coaches at Moon Prep. So before we get started, can you introduce yourself, Kavya?
Yeah, of course. Hi, my name is Kavya. I'm currently a first year medical student, and I was a part or am a part of a current BSMD program. And yeah,
Okay, so before we kind of dive into the MCAT versus no MCAT, Nicole, can you tell us what the MCAT even stands for?
Yeah, MCAT stands for Medical College Admission Test.
Okay. Now, Kavya, as someone who's had to take it, and Nicole and I are blessed that we haven't, what does it test?
yeah, basically the MCAT is like the standardized test that you take for medical schools. You can think of it as like the SAT or ACT for college, but this is for med school instead.
Mm-hmm. A little bit more intense, a lot more studying it seems to
Yeah.
go in. I know I have some med school students who have literally spent their entire summers studying for the MCAT, whereas I mean some kids do it for the SAT or ACT, but it's definitely on a much higher scale.
Yeah.
Now, what is the score? What is it scored out of, the MCAT?
Yeah. So the MCAT is scored on a scale of 472 to 528. And it's based on four different sections, each of which you can get a score from 118 to 132.
And what would you qualify as a good score? And I guess let's talk more about like BSMD first. Like what typically do BSMDs require?
So there's a bit of a range on where, like what score BSMD programs require, but I would say typically it's usually in the 500s to like the 510 range, typically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a few that I can think of that were more like Hofstra's, I think is like what, a 514? I could be making that up. No, 510, 511. Just kidding. I think some of the Florida programs too are like a 514 or a
Or
550.
14.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So those are kind of outliers, whereas I think most programs, some don't require an MCAT score, but some of them are a little bit higher.
Yeah.
Now, what about for traditional, like for MD, what would you say is like the a good score or even like the average score for applicants?
I think at a minimum, like to be pretty competitive or to put yourself in that category, you want to get at least a 510, 511 or higher.
Mm-hmm.
That typically puts you at about like the 80th percentile, but just based on like what my peers say and what I've seen, a lot of students are aiming for at least like 515 or higher, if not like 520s to be a lot more competitive.
Yeah, I think it definitely depends. Is a little bit more, just like I think SAT, ACT, it's a little bit more of like where you're going, what
Mhm.
kind of might need. Like for Harvard, I'm sure their MCAT score is going to be a lot higher than someplace like the SUNY upstate schools. Like there's, yeah, it looks like the medium MCAT for Harvard is a 521 versus like for SUNY upstate, it's a 511 for their median MCAT.
Yeah.
So it will definitely vary based on like where you're interested in going on what is going to be a good score versus, below average.
Yeah.
And there's also DO schools. I don't know if you know off the top of your head because you're in an MD program, but do you know for DOs what the kind of average score should be for them?
I believe it's like in the 500s range on average. I want to say like 503 to 505.
Yeah,
But
I think that's what I saw too, if I remember properly. So
yeah,
it is a lot.
yeah. But I think it's
Yeah.
more like consistently in the 500s
Mm-hmm.
range for DOs.
I know Nova, I think is a 502. And there are some MD programs that are on the lower end, like 495, but that's kind of rare.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it'd be nice. It'd be a lot nicer.
Yeah.
And I guess one important thing to note too is like the scores don't necessarily relate to like what the average is for like the medical school itself, if that makes sense. So for like the BSMD program, like they'll have set numbers that you need to get a 510, even if for that year, like the average accepted student was like a 515 or a 516. So that can be like one of the, I'm sure we'll talk about this later too. One of the big advantages of that is that, you know, you might be able to get into a school with like a lower MCAT score.
Yeah.
Now, if they're not in a BSMD program, like kind of on an accelerated pathway too, when do you usually recommend someone to take the MCAT?
For the traditional pre-med route, I would typically recommend taking the MCAT after you've taken like your core science and math classes. So that's like bio, biochem, chem, orgo, genetics, and physics. I would
Mm-hmm.
say because the MCAT is a test that's more tailored to the sciences. And then there's some like statistics involved, but pretty basic, I would say. So usually that ends up being, if you want to just do 4 years of undergrad and go straight into medical school, you need to have your score in usually by April, May of your junior year of undergrad, so you can start applying. And that's
Mm-hmm.
usually when the applications open for that cycle. So I usually would say like take it at the earliest the summer before or
Mm-hmm.
anytime during your junior year before April.
Agreed. I think it's so dependent on like their testing abilities too. Some kids just like really struggle with standardized tests, and so they might want to have the chance or deal with testing anxiety or whatever it might be. So they might want the chance to take it twice or have that option. And so by taking it earlier, you have more options and more possibilities to take it more often without kind of delaying your applications.
Yeah, exactly.
When did you take your MCAT?
I took my MCAT in my technically spring of my junior year.
Okay. Are you like on an accelerated path?
No, I'm in a 4+4.
Swap path. Okay, perfect. Because I don't know if you know this off the tech, because off the top of your head, because it probably does vary from place to place. But do you know when BSMD programs typically require students to take the MCAT? I honestly don't know.
I think it varies from program to program. For the programs that, so some programs will make you fill out like an AMCAS application, which is like the med school application, even though like you're going to their med school just for like the paperwork sake. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and they can like take it at a much later date. So for some, it's like you have to get it in by like September. You have to take your MCAT before like that cycle goes through. So like basically September of your senior year, you need to have a score in. So
Okay, so you get a little bit more
process.
time.
Yeah.
That's nice. Okay. All right. Now, how long does it typically take to study? Like, how long did you study for your MCAT?
I studied for about 3 months for it. And for 2 of those months, I was also working.
Mm.
So it honestly varies from person to person. I know some people takes like the whole summer, like 3 months where they're just studying so they can just grind it out and like get it done with, versus people who are like in school and bouncing a lot, they can study over like a 6 to 9 month period and
Mm-hmm.
then take it.
Yeah. I think I read somewhere that like the average student will spend like 200 to 300 hours of studying in total. And of course, once again, that's just like a random stat. I'm sure some people study less and some people study much, much more.
Mhm.
But then just because of like the length of the test, it's like a lot of just endurance that
Yeah,
you're really building up. Because how long is the MCAT now?
it's like 7.5 to 8 hours.
Which is like unfathomable to me. I can't imagine
That's
doing it.
including the breaks though, yeah.
Yeah, but still, the breaks
Yeah,
are 4 hours long.
that's a lot of time.
A lot
Yeah.
of time. So I feel like that's like half of what the studying has to be is of course like the depth and breadth of knowledge that you have to have, but also just like that stamina to pay attention for 7+ hours.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, do you think a lot of kids take like a gap year to prepare for the MCAT?
So I would say for like the traditional route to medical school, gap years are a lot more common and expected nowadays. I think in my medical school, more than 50% of my class, I think 75% of my class took at least one gap year.
Wow, that's a crazy stat.
Yeah, so I think it's more of the norm now to take gap years. That's just the nature of like how competitive med school is these days. So some people take a gap year because they take their MCAT like a year later, like their senior year, or some
Mm,
people use their gap years to study for the MCAT.
yeah,
So
it just depends on what you prioritized in your undergrad. If you got a good resume, maybe it's MCAT. If the resume needs a bit of help, maybe working or building activities. Ooh, that's crazy. Okay. And of course, for like BSMD programs, a lot of the times they don't always allow that time where you can take that gap year. So you might have to kind of do it the traditional route or traditional kind of taking your junior or senior year and going into it. So you might have not have the luxury of 3 months to study kind of unperturbed.
yeah,
All right. I'm going to throw this next one to you, Nicole. Let's talk a little bit about BSMD. Do all BSMD programs require the MCAT?
No, not all schools require the MCAT, not all programs. The majority of the programs that do require it do require a minimum score.
Mhm.
So not just having taken a test, but you do have to, like we were talking before, have that minimum. Typically they're around those kind of low 500 to like 510 or something like that. Some schools that don't, REMS, the Rochester program, Brown is a big one, UMKC is a big one, and Baylor. Some schools that do and have minimum scores. We've talked about Hofstra, FAU, UConn, Alabama, and then UPenn is kind of an outlier. They do not require the MCAT, but they are a test optional school for BSMD, meaning you can get in without an SAT or an ACT, which is kind of rare. There's only a few of those. So if you do get in without an SAT or ACT, you do have to take the MCAT. So it's not test optional all throughout. You have to
Yeah,
take a test at some point.
you have to do it sometime. If it's in high school or undergrad, which
Yeah.
one do you prefer?
Which is usually the reason why so many of our families want the non-required MCAT schools, just because they don't want to have to test anymore. But yeah, you do have to still take something for them.
Yeah. And there's like, I think like a third category too, where you have to take the MCAT, but you don't have to get a minimum score too. Like the New Jersey medical school programs are like that, where you just take the MCAT. Um, I think they like recommend that you get a certain score and maybe are expecting you to get a certain score, but it's not required. GW is also kind of another outlier. I believe in the past, at least, I'm not sure if it's still the case, but they just required you to take a practice test. So no MCAT score itself, no minimums required. You don't even have to pay to take it. It's just a practice test. So it is kind of nice.
Yeah. And there's definitely some schools that are a lot more strict than others, especially when it comes to like GPA as well, which I think we'll talk about later.
Yes, definitely. So let's talk about like the number of tests. Because of course, like in high school, you can take the SAT or ACT really as many times as you might need. What about for the MCAT? Are you allowed to take the MCAT more than once?
I would say that of the BSMD programs I've heard of, most of the time they only allow you to take it once, and a few of them let you take it 2 times. Depending on the program though, like there's some leniency. Like if you are in a program where you have to get a certain score and you're like very close to it, they might let you take it a second time so you can get above that. But that's not all programs.
Yeah, I had a student who was at the University of Central Florida program, which I believe they've discontinued now for like this upcoming cycle, but their requirement was quite high. I think it was like a 514 or a 515. And I guess this is one thing we should have addressed too when we're talking about like minimum scores. But for him, like you not only had to get the 514 or 515 or whatever it is, but you also had to get minimum in like a minimum score in each section. Maybe like a 123 or 125. I can't remember what it was. So for his score, he actually did get above like the minimum score that he needed to get. But in one of his sections, he was like 1 or 2 points below. And of course, it was like the car section that he was below in the points. And so like the medical school gave him an option, like, you can either retake it. We're not going to give you an exception because you are below like what we require, or you can withdraw from the program and apply out to other medical schools. And ironically, he ended up applying, kind of pulling out of the program. He didn't want to take the MCAT again. He ended up applying regular and he got into that same medical school anyway. So it didn't really even end up mattering. But, that can sometimes be what medical schools will do, is not only like the minimum score, but minimum in each section too.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Nicole, when you're making like college lists for students, BSMD lists kind of specifically, do you think these BSMD programs that don't require MCAT are more competitive and more popular with students?
They're definitely more popular with students. I'd say we probably get students that apply to the top that don't need an MCAT. Like you were thinking UMKC Brown, right? Like tons and tons of students are applying to those just because they're great programs anyway. In terms of, are they more competitive? I don't think so, like across the board. Some of the outliers that are the super, super competitive ones are those no MCAT schools, but I think in general, I mean, BSMD is just so highly competitive in overall. And we're talking about like amount of seats offered and things like that. Schools that do require, and even schools that are a little bit stricter, can be more competitive.
Like I would say that I have some kids who are like, I definitely want to avoid the MCAT. Like that's what I want to prioritize on my college list. And then I have some kids who are like, here's what I'm kind of looking for with my MCAT. I'm willing to go up to a 510 or whatever it is. And don't want anything higher. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
like kids, and then some kids who are like, I don't care. I'll go anywhere.
Yes.
And
And like Toledo is not, like they don't require the MCAT, but they're also an early assurance program. So I don't think it's like rule of thumb that the non-MCAT schools are like the higher top tier schools. I think it's a variation.
definitely depends on what we're
Yes,
looking
but
for.
we definitely get students and families who say getting through the SAT, ACT was hard enough. We do not want to apply to any schools that require the MCAT. So
Mhm.
we we talk them through, is that the best option for them, and kind of everything that comes in with that. But yeah.
Yeah, because some of these BSMD programs that don't have an MCAT are just kind of naturally, I think, more competitive. Like Case Western is super competitive. UPIT is just super competitive. Brown is super competitive. I mean, I don't necessarily know if it's because they're at because they don't require the MCAT, or because they're just like more name brand, more recognizable
Yeah.
than a school like the College of New Jersey, for example. Like I love their program, but like, they definitely don't have the name recognition that a Case Western or Brown has, for example. So I
Hmm.
think that maybe it's hard to pinpoint if that's the reason why some of these programs are competitive, or just because they're good overall
Yes.
programs.
And I think it's also important to, when we're talking to families, to, like Kavya was mentioning before, a competitive score or the minimum score for BSMD is usually not even close to a competitive score at
Mhm.
just like for a traditional. Yes, you could take the MCAT more than once at that point. You could take a gap year usually, but my recommendation is, if you're applying BSMD, is add some schools that you're interested in, that you're excited about, that do still require it. Because if it's a lower, like a 505 minimum, it's going to be much easier for you probably later on than trying to get that competitive med school score if you were
I
doing a traditional route.
completely agree. I mean, I don't think an MCAT requirement would necessarily deter me from a school. I mean, I think there are some that are a little bit more intense, like we were talking about the 514 or 515 kind of scores. Those are quite high. Um, but a 510, you know, it definitely is doable, and it definitely is like slightly below the average of what a student is getting who's accepted into schools. And so, yeah, overall, I completely agree. An MCAT requirement isn't necessarily a deal breaker, in my opinion, for a good school. Okay, switching gears a little bit back to like MCAT prep. Do a lot of these BSMD programs offer prep within the program? I don't know if either of you guys know that answer.
I would say not really, in terms of like traditional MCAT prep, like study guide, study material, test material. a lot of that is kind of on the student's own merit. But I do know a lot of programs do have like specific BSMD advisors for the students in the program who they can like talk to for advice or feedback on how to study, but they don't offer any direct MCAT prep that I know of.
Yeah, the only one that I've ever seen that offers is the University of Nevada's program, and they're suspended or canceled. So that's the only one I'd ever read on their website that they offer like an MCAT course. Other than that, I think you're totally right that it's mostly just like a here's some resources and guides for you, but you're kind of on your own. Okay, so we talked a little bit about MCAT. What about kind of the other edge of that sword of BSMD programs where a lot of them do require like GPA requirements? So of course that's kind of something else to think about when you're doing like an MCAT versus no MCAT school. Do BSMD programs typically have a minimum score requirement? Or sorry, minimum GPA requirement?
Yeah, we figured we'd touch on this a little bit too. Like you said, it's just kind of that other end of the sword. A lot of them do. There are some that don't. And even within the ones that do have a requirement, I know there's definitely some that are a lot stricter than others. I know NYIT, their BSDO program is extremely strict. I've heard stories of students getting removed from the program by, barely missing that number. And I believe Hofstra too is pretty strict, and they set their GPA up a little bit. Like, you have your regular GPA, then you have your science GPA, and they're very, very hard on what those are.
Do you know what Hofstra's are off the top of your head?
I think Hofstra's is around a 3.7,
That's
but
what
I
I was
could
thinking.
be, yeah, I think it's around a 3.7. And I think NYIT, I think it might even be a 3.5 or a 3.6, but I know that, last year they dropped at least 5 kids from their program
Hmm.
for not meeting it. And then I know, some schools, Brown is less strict, which is kind of odd. Like if you think about how competitive Brown is in general to get into, but I've heard that they are less strict in terms of their GPA requirement. A lot of their courses are able to be taken as just like a pass fail.
Hmm.
So I think
That's what I've heard too.
having,
I'll go for it.
I was gonna say, I think having the open curriculum helps, where some programs like this is what you're taking and that is it, whereas they're definitely a lot more lenient with what you're taking. So I think that probably helps students too with that minimum.
Yeah, definitely. The Brown program, I think you just have to remain in good academic standing, like whatever that
Yes.
means. I
Yeah.
talked to like a student and like that did not seem to be a concern for like, really anyone in the program. Cause I mean, I'm sure they're all like high achieving, doing well in their courses and motivated, but it didn't seem like, that was something that they were super strict about. And I guess to put into context too, like the 3.7 for Hofstra and like the 510 or 511 MCAT score that they require, the medium MCAT for Hofstra to get in like the traditional route was a 519. A medium GPA was a 3.86. So if you're gonna go the traditional route, not only are you like fighting against like way more people, but you also have to have like much higher stats. And so even if they do kind of have these higher requirements, you're still getting in like quote unquote the easier way, even though it's not easy at all. It still does require a lot of work to get accepted. So it is definitely something to like kind of take in consideration as you're looking at these programs. It's like, yes, even if it does have an MCAT, it's still like can be a really big benefit.
Just to add on, something else I think that should be considered if you're applying is whether or not your program for the BS or BA, MD has a specific major you have to do versus if you have the freedom to do any major, because that can also kind of affect what courses you're taking and what you have to balance in terms of your GPA.
That's a great point. Because like one is like for Drexel, for example, you have to pick between like what is it, biochem, something with like engineering. I want to say like bioengineering and then one other major. Like what was it? Those like are not your strengths. And so it might not be to your advantage to apply to those types of programs if those classes that you're going to be kind of forced into are not where you can excel with your GPA and your overall academic career. That's a really good point.
Yeah, I
Okay.
know some people in my program, like my program allows us to take any major as long as we get like a BS degree, and we have to take certain courses in the sciences that are required for med school. But I know people that are majoring in like dance and like history and things like that. So you do have like flexibility with some programs.
Oh, wow. Are they doing like a double major?
Yeah, you end up getting enough most of the time to like, at least minor in the sciences just because of the
Mhm.
nature of pre-med courses, but a lot of people can double major or just minor in a lot of things at least.
I think that's important for people to hear too, is like, you do not have to do a biology major to one, do BSMD or to do medical school. Like there's so much flexibility. So it's kind of cool to hear that a BSMD student is doing dance or history or if it, journalism majors or um, things like that where it's like non-traditional. But that's kind of the beauty, I think, of these programs is it does allow you to explore things that you might not have. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the benefits of not having to take the MCAT. What do you think some of those might be, Nicole?
I think the general one for our students, the benefits that they consider is just one less thing to worry about, one less stressor, one thing checked off their list. Obviously, they're still probably going to be worrying about meeting those GPA requirements and things like that, but it is one major thing checked off. And then I think the other thing is probably the study time, like not having that study time that you need to just have this test, kind of hanging over your head. You can spend more of your time focusing on classes, research, other extracurriculars, things like that. Kavya, anything to add to that since you did have to take it? So anything that you think would have been a benefit to not have to?
Yeah, I definitely thought about it before I took the MCAT. Like, I wish I didn't have to. I just think in general, like being a pre-med student is very taxing in general, even if you are in a program sometimes. So I think just the thought of not having to take that test that so many people complain about in the pre-med community is just very rewarding for people that don't have to take it.
You can imagine. Yeah, I would completely agree. That's what I always tell kids too whenever we're writing essays about like I think for Penn State, you don't have to take the essay or the MCAT. And so in the first draft of their essays, they're like, well, I don't have to take the MCAT. And so that's like fantastic. And that's all they say about it. But I think that the second point that you made, Nicole, about being able to focus on classes and different extracurriculars is like really um a big part of where it could be like you could have some like different skills that are being gained like maybe because you didn't have to take the MCAT you can go do like a study abroad program over the summer if like your program allows it or you know work at a really cool like research internship or whatever it might be that you might not have had time for so yeah I think it's like that growth that can happen potentially outside of the test. Now, ironically, there might be some benefits to having to take the MCAT. And so, Kavya, as someone who did take the MCAT, what would you say is some of those benefits of taking that test?
Yeah, I would say that first of all, a lot of these BSMD programs require you to take science courses or the pre-medical courses. So you end up taking, orgo, chemistry, biology, physics, biochem anyways. And that's like a good chunk at least of what's on the MCAT. So you're already learning a lot of this material in your classes at school. So it can kind of go in tandem with your studying for the MCAT. So you're not completely starting, rock bottom. You already have some leverage just based on the classes you're taking. And then another benefit I personally found from taking the MCAT was it really helped with my like feeling of imposter syndrome, like being in a BSMD program. I think I was kind of scared to like go to med school because I like felt like I didn't have that typical, like I needed to prove myself experience of being a pre-med because I was in a guaranteed program. But I think studying for the MCAT and taking the MCAT kind of gave me like a score for me to know where I'm at and know where I'm at compared to the average pre-med or like the average student at my medical school. So I think it kind of like boosted my confidence because I was able to pass like the minimum score for my program and like get the score that I personally got. And that kind of address that end of things for me too.
I think it
That's one
has to
thing.
be like a prideful moment to get
Mm-hmm.
a score. If you don't have to, okay, that's great. You kind of, something you don't have to do. But if you do have to do it and you do well, I think you must be really proud of that. It's just something that would probably make you feel good after.
No, yeah,
After
I was just happy to pass like that bare minimum score. I was like, hallelujah.
I bet.
And there are so many tests in medical school that you have to take, right? And I think maybe the more practice, I don't know this personally, but I'm assuming like the more confidence you get with testing and things like that could probably boost morale when coming down to those other exams.
Yeah, I would say like this is like far down the road for some of the listeners, I'm guessing, but you end up taking step exams at the towards the middle of med school and the beginning of residency. And those exams are very, very long too. So you definitely have to build up your stamina for taking long exams. My med school exams usually end up being like 2 to 4 hours each. So it's a lot of endurance building, I would say, for taking tests.
That's wild. That's really wild. It's so long on tests, but I guess it makes sense is, if you're in surgery, you're going to be having to keep that mental stamina for hours on end. So it is kind of just helping to prepare you for those different kind of hurdles that you might encounter as a physician. That's interesting
You'll
though.
never.
Oh, go for it. Sorry, Nicole. I'll go over you.
I guess you'll never avoid things like that. Some want to avoid, submitting SAT, ACT, some want to avoid taking the MCAT, but you'll never avoid like those moments where you will have to be focused for long periods of time and having that stamina.
Anything else you guys can think to add about no MCAT or MCAT schools?
Um, I would say when I was applying to BSMD programs, I was able to like reach out to current students or older students in the programs to see like their perspective and experience,
Mm-hmm.
and opinions about like GPA requirements and MCAT requirements. And I will say that a lot of the times having these requirements like kind of keeps you in check, I think is the right word. Like it keeps you reminded of like what your goal is, like to become a doctor, to like get through med school and all those things. And I feel like what I've heard from a lot of upperclassmen that helped me make my decision for which BSMD program to go to, kind of like you could do the bare minimum and like just like skate by because you can, or a lot of other students choose to like do as well as possible and like knowing they have like a safety net of like they can do a little bit less than the average and still go to medical school kind of like reassures them to kind of like full send their efforts, I guess. So that could be something else to consider when you're picking programs.
If you could do it all over again, would you still pick, your same program where you did have an MCAT that you was required, or would you choose to go for a program that didn't have that requirement?
I would stick with what I did. Um, I just think I think I'm better for going through that process. And I also think it helps with like when you're in med school, everyone can relate to the idea of taking the MCAT and studying for that exam. Um, so yeah, I would do it again. And I really liked my program, especially. I tried to choose my programs based on like the medical school and the undergrad experience related to the medical school because I felt like that would impact me much more than one exam.
Yeah, I suppose if you only take one piece of advice from us today is like don't necessarily write off a program that is right in every other aspect just because they require the MCAT. Um, I think your advice about like talking to older students in the program if you can, or trying to understand a little bit more about like what the program actually is requiring can be helpful. And I think that that's something too that on like the BSMD websites, like I think sometimes it scares off kids because they'll see it's not guaranteed. And a lot of parents will say like, is this program 100% guaranteed? It's like, well, nothing is 100% guaranteed because you always have to meet those requirements. Like, they still want to make sure that they're putting together competent doctors who aren't going to go out and like be killing people. And we'll be listening to a podcast about like, this medical school that put out incompetent doctors in like 10 years. That's like the last thing that they want. And so it's more important, I think, to make sure that they do have some checks in place, just like you said, to make sure that kids are learning. And whenever they go to medical school, they're not failing. So I think that that's part of the reason why they have these types of things. If it's GPA or MCAT requirements, is they don't want to invest all this time and effort into you for you not to have gained that knowledge and that understanding. So yeah, I kind of agree. I think MCAT requirements, GPA requirements, most of them don't necessarily scare me off of the programs when I'm advising my students which ones to put on their lists or to even attend.
Just to add on, I would say like if you look on the websites or you're scrolling through Reddit and you see like the matriculation rate for the students in BSMD programs from undergrad into the med school, if it's not like high 90s or 100%, that's not necessarily due to students like failing out or like not being able to meet the requirements. I think I can like personally like remember people in my program. There's usually people per year that like choose not to go into medicine or choose to take more gap years or choose like a different career altogether. So
Yeah, things will change. I think it was Kristen, our CEO, that was telling us about this a long time ago. Like one of the inventors of, I think, the Casper like mattress or something like that was like a brown plebe student. I could be totally misremembering this, but like, sometimes they just like find different passions and different interests and they drop out of the program to do different things. And that's like totally valid and totally fine to do. So yeah, don't forget to like and subscribe to our podcast. We'll be back with some more stuff related to BSMD and med school admissions. But until next time, have a great day.